you. May I ask Councillor Gardner to sing the national anthem? Councillor Gardner's feeling a little hurt that you've brought in some guest singers.
Absolutely not.
Okay, but it's not, we've not demoted you in any way. We really appreciate you singing the national
I
anthem.
still have my votes, I'm okay.
Thank you, Councillor Gardner.
Oh, Canada, our home and native land, true patriot love in all thy son's command. Car ton bras sait porter l'épée, il sait porter la croix. Ton histoire est une épopée des plus brillants exploits. God keep our land glorious and free. Oh, Canada, we stand on guard for thee. Oh, Canada, we stand on guard for thee.
Councillor Gardner.
Wait till the applause dies down.
We acknowledge that we are gathering on the traditional territory of the Mohawk people of Akwesasne. Madam Clerk, roll call.
Mayor Bernadette Clement.
Présent.
Councillors Claude
Here.
McIntosh. Elaine McDonald.
Present.
Sid Garner.
See,
Dean Hollingsworth.
Present.
Councillors Moïse Dupin.
Present.
Glenn Grant.
Present.
Éric Bergeron.
Present?
I switched places.
It's okay.
Councillor Justin
Get up.
Towndell.
Present.
And Councillor Éric Bergeron.
Present again.
Councillors Todd Bennett and Kelly Linebar have sent in their regrets.
Thank you. Before we go to additions, I'd just like to mention to councillors that in your mailboxes you should have pins from the Mohawk Council of Akwesasne. So the Grand Chief wanted to make sure that as a follow-up to our conversation, our meeting the other day, he had suggested that he could give pins as gifts, and so you all have received those. If you want more, please let me know, because he's given us quite a number of those pins. Thank you. Any additions, deletions, or amendments? Councillor Bergeron?
Yes, I'd like to move item number 1 from consent correspondence into reports, if I can.
Thank you. Any other additions, deletions? Madam Clerk?
I have none, Madam Mayor.
Adoption of the agenda. Need a motion? Councillor Elaine McDonald, Councillor McIntosh, all in favor? Carried. Any disclosure of interest? Seeing none, we'll go to Committee of the Whole. I need a motion. Councillor Grant, Councillor Gardner, all in favor? Carried. Adoption of the minutes for the meeting of June 24th, 2019. Councillor Lane, Councillor Sid, any comments, corrections? All in favor? Carried. Madam Clerk.
We have 2 presentations this evening, Madam Mayor. The first one is Constable Robin Rouet, who has won the Men's Grand Masters, and we are inviting him to sign the Book of Recognition. But I believe that Chief Aikman is here to present him this evening.
Police Chief Aikman, welcome.
Thank you, Your Worship. Council, Your Worship, it's always my pleasure to appear before you, even more so this evening when I get to share a good news story. Special Constable Robin Rouet is here with us this evening. He's an 18-year veteran of our Court Bureau and has dedicated his life to leading a very healthy existence, far more so than many of us have. I wish I could say I have a physique such as his, but never. So he's recently competed in the UFE Revolution bodybuilding contest in the Grand Masters division, and was successful in coming out as the champion of that particular event. So we're honored on behalf of the Cornwall Police Service to have Special Constable Rouet here to sign your Book of Recognition, and we thank you for that. Words?
ask you to say a few words? Can you tell us a little bit about Grandmasters and the Ultimate Fitness event? Just give us an explanation.
The Grandmasters is basically a better way of saying over 50 category. A lot better, but unfortunately it is a over 50 division, and I've been working out for 37, 38 years.
Wow.
Competed after my children were grown, and then I had to retire because of hip problems. I ended up having a hip surgery 5 years ago, and I decided as a challenge to come back and see if I could do it again. And I was able to come back and be successful, and now it's like, I'm not sure if I want to continue, because as a pro, you can no longer compete as a grandmaster. It's an open division. You're now competing against people in their 20s and 30s from across the world in the world championships, and I don't believe that's something that I'm ready to undertake. So
Pesky millennials, I tell you.
yes.
So how much do you train?
I train about 2-3 hours a day, pretty much every day. It's a passion. The hardest part is then obviously the diet. That's where it gets a little, the discipline comes in. But the training is the fun part, believe it or not. Some people think I'm not normal to enjoy that type of pain that much, but it's just something that I've enjoyed. Claude will attest to that. We go way back to Maximum Fitness days back in
I wasn't a lifter.
You were quite a squash player from what I can remember.
Well, listen, congratulations. Thank you for representing our area in that way and being a special constable with our Cornwall Police Service. Thank you, Chief Aikman, for being here as well. So
Thank you.
congrats.
Thanks a lot.
Our second presentation is the 5-year review of the 10-year housing and homelessness plan. And with us this evening is Ken Foles from REFAT Consulting and our own Melissa Morgan from Community Housing Supervisor.
Our own, do you like that? Our own?
Our own.
Sure. Want to come on up, Ms. Morgan?
Oh, the book.
Guess you don't need to read from that anyway, huh? To be a brief presentation.
Thank you, Ms. Castanet. Thank you, Councillor Lang.
Yeah.
Ms. Morgan?
Good evening, Your Worship, Council. Thank you for allowing us time on this evening's agenda to present to you our recommendations for the 5-year review of the 10-year housing plan. With me this evening is Mr. Ken Foles from REFAT Consulting. Mr. Foles has spent the last 30 years in the municipal...
He's a Grand Master.
He's a Grand Master of Housing and Planning, absolutely. He has spent 10 years in municipal planning and housing with the City of Ottawa. He was the former housing manager with the City of Ottawa. And he's also completed various consulting projects for many municipalities throughout the province. Just by way of a brief introduction, we're not going to go through the entire presentation verbatim. But as a way of a brief introduction, this is the 5-year update. The original plan, housing plan, was drafted in 2014 as a result of the province's initiative through the long-term affordable housing strategy. And it offered the opportunity for service managers to provide engagement with the broader community, to assess local needs and priorities and identify strategies that would help us achieve housing outcomes. This plays a critical function in how we as the service manager are addressing housing and homelessness locally within the City of Cornwall and the United Counties of Stormont, Dundas, and Glengarry. Updating the housing plan also offers us an opportunity as service managers to reflect on the previous 5 years, as well as review the next 5 years and perhaps look within our crystal ball, trying to find a way to improve a system of housing and homelessness within our community. As indicated, the brief history of the housing plan, in 2010, the ministry drafted the long-term affordable housing strategy, which basically set priorities and goals for both the ministry and service managers. As a result of that strategy, in 2011, the Housing Services Act was redeveloped and came into effect in 2012. And part of that Housing Act required service managers to develop a 10-year housing plan. Local plans, as I indicated, were originally developed by service managers in consultation with community members, service providers, and other stakeholders, and that original plan came into effect January 1st, 2014. The Housing Services Act also stipulates that every 5 years, service managers must update their plan, which is what brings us here this evening. Since the development of the long-term affordable housing strategy and initial plans, the ministry has made some of their own changes, including introducing a policy statement, which is the service manager's housing and homelessness plans, and it was updated in 2011 to include the Ontario Housing Policy Statement. And this aligns with the provincial priorities established in the 2016 update of the long-term affordable housing strategy. So there have been some ministry changes that have occurred since our initial plan. And service managers are required to ensure that the updated plan is consistent with these updated changes to the ministry plans as well, and policies. A brief overview of our current plan. Our current plan contains 10 strategies. Some of these strategies were short in nature and have been completed, and some of them continue to be ongoing strategies, which are now forming part of our reframed recommendations of our 5-year housing update. As mentioned earlier, the Housing Services Act does require us to update our plan every 5 years. And this, it also requires us to complete an annual update. This annual update would have been presented to Council at the June 10th Council meeting for the 2018-19 year. What we're presenting to you this evening are recommendations on the next 5 years moving forward. As part of the 5-year review process, we not only had to look at mandatory requirements as set by the province in terms of their policy statements and strategies, but this also afforded us a really good opportunity to not only look at the past, but what was going on or what we think is going to go on in the future. Many changes have also occurred, including the political landscape, the economy, as well as the ministry's policy statement. So it's a perfect opportunity for us to have reviewed this. As part of the 5-year plan, we decided to hire a consultant, which is why Mr. Folds from REFACT is here with us this evening. Before I turn it over to Mr. Folds, I would like to take the opportunity to acknowledge our project team who has, over the last 5 or 6 months, accepted all of the meeting bites I have sent to them. So I appreciate all of their efforts. And they are Natasha Hess, who is the accounting coordinator with Shared Services, Tammy Marcel, the administrative assistant for social housing services, and Mary Joy Smith, division manager with the planning division. And of course, we couldn't have done this without the help of our consultants, Mr. Ken Folds and Mr. Scott Robertson. And I will now turn it over to Mr. Folds, who's going to give you the meat and potatoes of why we're here this evening.
Thanks very much, Melissa. Worship, members of council. As Melissa mentioned, my colleague Scott Robertson was unable to be here tonight, so he was unable to share in our presentation, but wanted to acknowledge his obligations on the project and thank him for that. In terms of the 5-year review process, I think it's important to understand the terms under which we were engaged. That was really to ensure that the housing and homeless plan that existed was continuing to reflect the realities of homelessness needs and housing within the community, to respond to those needs in a meaningful way, to be consistent with the province's rules as they establish in the legislation and the policy framework, and also to make sure that the plan was consistent with the city's corporate strategy. So within that framework, we developed a fairly comprehensive process, and it was compressed due to the time that we were dealing with. A number of stakeholder activities were involved. We talked to key informants. We held a couple of focus groups. We held a number of town hall sessions, both in the city and in the counties. We also had a very successful online community-oriented survey where we had over 500 responses from the community, which was very good. And the city also undertook an online agency intake survey that garnered another 300 responses. So we were able to get quite a bit of feedback from folks out there. We also took some time to work with staff to review the current plan and the ministry's technical requirements. And then we worked on a couple of workshops with staff to work through some of what was working, what wasn't working, addressing those new requirements and addressing those needs, all to develop a reframed plan and report to council. So in terms of the stakeholder themes that came out, there was sort of a number of key themes. We wanted to highlight 6 for you here tonight. Certainly the fact that there's a need for more affordable housing in the community, especially for single and non-senior households, and that's evidenced by the wait list, and it was certainly reinforced by the folks that we talked to in the community. We also know that those who are more vulnerable in the community and require supports, there's also needs for more housing in that regard as well. And that's an important part because some of those supports help keep people housed. Where they're not able to maintain their housing is when they start interfacing with the system. The other thing, obviously, that's important when you have a system that serves such diverse needs is an obligation to coordinate and collaborate that. And while there's a lot of excellent participation from stakeholders, we heard time and again that a bit more coordination and alignment might be helpful in terms of better serving those folks who need those requirements in the community. I think a very encouraging other thing we heard was a recognition that private landlords need to be part of the solution in the community. And I think hand in glove with that was interesting was also there needs to be some incentives to help get the private market more engaged in the system. So I think there's awareness, and again, to be clear, we spoke with stakeholders in the private sector, public sector, advocates for support agencies. So to have that message coming out was encouraging in that people recognized we had to work together collectively to find those solutions. And I think that led to the last point there, making the connection between affordable housing and economic development. Housing cuts across so many aspects of what a healthy community involves. And I think as evidenced in some of the recent activities here, I think there's a clear understanding that when you don't have appropriate housing, it starts to become issues, not only for the vulnerable people in the community, but for economic growth and some of those other aspirations that you might have. So in terms of looking at the community, I think one of the clear messages taking those themes together was to focus on the whole continuum of housing. You can see here along the bottom is a visual graphic showing the housing continuum with on the left-hand side homelessness, emergency shelters, working your way all the way up to the market side of the equation on the right. And the reality is that when you start looking and trying to address different facets of that system, they're connected. So you have to understand about dealing with those solutions across the whole spectrum. How involved the partners should be, how involved municipal government should be. Those are all discussions, but it's clear that it's all about community in the end. So one of the big themes I think that came out of the stakeholder piece was really focusing on that whole sense of community. So that led us to rethinking about what the current plan could or should become in light of this new information. So we talked about reframing the current plan. In that regard, there was a notion to really build on the current work that had been done. Obviously, as Melissa identified, there were some actions that were undertaken and completed already. There's more action needed in other areas. There's also a clear recognition in the last 5 years that there's been changes in the community, and those needs have to be reflected in any plan looking forward. Has to have regard for the stakeholder feedback that we heard. With the ministry's announcement of some additional policy areas in 2016, those wouldn't have been incorporated at the time the original plan was developed. So bringing those into the equation and looking forward. I think a big part of what we also wanted to identify is if there's areas where we don't know things, let's identify those knowledge gaps to fill in those blanks going forward. And then lastly, I think a reality is that there's been quite a bit of upheaval in the shifting policy environment. We've had an announcement of a federal national housing strategy in the last couple of years. We've had changes in the provincial political landscape. that are continuing to have some reverberations, and we might be facing some additional considerations this fall with the federal election. All of those policy issues twist and turn, and making a plan within that context becomes a bit challenging. So with that in mind, the objectives we had set out for the reframed plan really fall into 4 key areas. And they really look at those, if we think about that housing continuum again, it sort of spans that spectrum of what's involved. So first of all, having a housing where people experience a housing crisis are housed or sheltered, making sure those most vulnerable in the system have access to housing. The second is to really keep the people that are housed still housed. So if they're encountering challenges, and you hear constantly, I think through the media, certainly we hear it throughout the province, that more and more people are a paycheck or two away from being in a difficult situation. So that if those people maintain their housing, they're less likely to cycle through the system and require those other services. So let's pay some attention to that. The third area is to really look at having the housing stock that exists out there, ensuring that it's suitable and it's maintained. Again, that goes to that notion of stability, but also means that you have a stable stock on which you can rely on depending on the changes in your marketplace. And then finally, where there are opportunities to increase the supply of appropriate housing, make sure that's enhanced. So I'll quickly give you a quick overview of the 4 vision areas and just some highlights of the objectives. I think you have the report in front of you with all the details, so I'll just highlight a few things. I think in that Community Vision 1, where we're talking about people who are most homeless or experiencing those housing crises, I think what we heard clearly, and in looking at the information, there's a need to really get a better understanding of that shared system, what that service system like that helps provide those supports. Again, you have a number of community agencies, municipal government, other quasi-public agencies providing these services, and having some coordination in how those services are delivered is important. So understanding more about the system, understanding how the services are delivered, and working together in partnership with those stakeholders to help move forward. The second part to that is actually then, once we understand that, enhancing the effectiveness of the system. So once we understand those dimensions and the people in the system that are delivering the services, helping coordinate and be more effective in terms of the delivery. And that really is a planning function of working with those folks. And I think the third part of objective or strategy within that vision is to then broaden that awareness out to the community so that they understand if there's someone in need, where would they best plug into the process to get the supports they need to get housing. For the second community vision, the focus is really on people who are currently housed but could be at risk of becoming homeless. And again, you'll see some common themes here in terms of the need to understand that network of supports and services, who's providing them. Do people within the system that provide those services understand who else is in that system? Are they coordinating effectively, or could they be working more collaboratively together to do that? So understanding about that system. We're looking here also specifically at the community housing portfolio, and by that we mean what could be historically termed as the social housing portfolio, and looking at the needs specifically there. Improving the effectiveness of those services is another common strategy here. And again, expanding the awareness of those services so that people know where to access the services and how to prevent people from experiencing housing loss. I think one of the interesting caveats we identified here in speaking with staff and seeing what's been done in other jurisdictions was that in community housing, if there's opportunities to actually help people address those support needs that may help them move on to that next step in terms of employment, you're going to have more successful tenancies and more opportunities to move on to more permanent forms of housing. So strategy number 4 here really speaks to that issue of examining the opportunities and where there's opportunities to actually build and promote a pilot program to expand on employment assistance. That would be an excellent way to help bring those people forward in terms of the supports and services they need. Community vision number 3 is really about maintaining suitable existing housing stock. So the focus here in the first instance is to really ensure the sustainability of assets, again, within that community housing portfolio. Most of those projects were built anywhere up to 50 years ago. Most are sort of edging in on that 35-year. As aging assets, there's a need for them to continue to provide affordability. It's a very important resource in the community. But having the basic information, like building condition assessments, capital needs priorities, and some funding to help move them forward is important to maintain and ensure that stock continues to provide that function in the community. But as the second strategy speaks to, it's not just about the community housing stock. It's also about the rental housing stock in the community and other parts that are affordable. So again, we talk here about providing more dialogue with the private sector in terms of private sector landlords, connecting them to supports that might exist out there. There's a lot of folks who really aren't prepared or not equipped to handle some of the support needs, so connecting them up with support agencies to help address those needs is a win-win both for the tenants and for the landlords. There's also been some very successful programming in terms of helping low-income homeowners renovate their homes and bring them up to standard. That's been a very popular program in the past, and I think there's a notion to continue to do that looking forward. And also to expand awareness of those programs that are out there. The last strategy speaks again about the community housing portfolio, but now starts to talk about it in a strategic way. So not just understanding the capital requirements, but now thinking strategically how to leverage those assets. As I mentioned, a number of them are in the 35 to 50 year age category, and equity has accumulated in that stock as the mortgages are paid down. When they mature, there's some interesting opportunities now about taking that assets and putting that to work by leveraging, redeveloping, renewing the assets, or actually building some others. And it could lead to decisions where certain stock might need to be disposed. So there's a study that's being suggested here in terms of a revitalization plan to help sort out those particular strategies. The last area relates to the supply of appropriate housing and enhancing it. And you'll see that the strategies here are really geared more to understanding the regional market. I think one of the challenges we faced here was that since the last plan was updated, 2016 census data has now come out, and there's some very rich information there. So sort of taking that and looking at it within the sub-theme areas, different parts of the counties. We heard loud and clear through the stakeholder process that there was different pressures being felt in different parts of the counties in the city, and that some of the needs that exist in that within that regional market need to be understood before you could make policy considerations around them. In that same regard, understanding the regulatory tools that are there to help promote affordable housing. So working on your official plan policies, following through on zoning and related policies, and streamlining the process to advance those development approvals for affordable housing. The third strategy really speaks to, again, enhancing that further and talking about appropriate tools and incentives to help advance supply. This is providing some incentives to the private sector to help stimulate some of that development, either through land, through dialogue with the local development industry, by providing additional tools and authorities that you have under the Municipal Act and other acts. And again, obviously also to look at opportunities here about exploring the home ownership options. It's an area that is not as much of a priority as some of the other stuff in terms of those who are vulnerable, but again, thinking about the whole broad spectrum, providing some supports in this regard to help those households expand so that some people have the ability to move into that part of the market. And lastly, really connecting the business community to advance the affordable housing opportunities. And that's, again, the notion that it's a community plan. The solutions aren't just the public sectors or the private sectors. It's a collection of the community response. So understanding those connections with the economic development, both in the city and county, and trying to promote those links and promote healthy communities is going to stand the service area in good stead over time.
So in terms of our next steps, we definitely need to finalize our strategies and actions. If you'll notice, we've gone from 12 strategies from our initial plan to 4 community visions with a number of strategies and actions. We need to define the priorities around each of those actions. So from now till the next 5 years are basically our very large to-do list. We need to determine performance measures. So we've drafted performance measures so that when we complete our annual updates or annual reviews to present to the ministry and to council, we can actually measure all of the actions that we've listed within the recommendations. We will need to formalize our plan and present it to council. It was scheduled to be on the council, the final report's scheduled to be on the council meeting for August the 12th. And then it does go to the ministry for final review, comment, and final approval. There are going to be a number of things that come from these recommendations that will also determine future council reports in terms of some of the actions that we will be taking. Mr. Folds had mentioned a needs assessment study, so those are some of the things going forward that you may see brought to council prior to annual reviews. In terms of updates as well, we will also be presenting regular updates to the Joint Liaison Committee on a regular basis, as well as this presentation in its entirety as well. And before we open it up to questions, I would be remiss if I didn't thank our administrator, Stacey Ferguson, who basically has given us the free rein and the support to really dive deep into this and really come up with a comprehensive set of visions and strategies that make sense moving forward within our community. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll start with Councillor Elaine McDonald.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. And thank you, Melissa. It's nice to hear somebody commend their supervisor. Good to hear. So I have a couple of quick questions. And one was with regard to the entry point, you mentioned, Mr. Folds, that it's important that people know in a crisis what the entry point into the various support systems we might have to prevent or somehow remedy homelessness as it happens. And granted, this is not likely something that's going to happen between 9 and 5. It's more likely between 5 p.m. and 9 a.m. the next day. So in Cornwall, who do you call? Where do you go?
Through to you, Your Worship. So we do have a number of initiatives already established with various stakeholders, Canadian Mental Health, Cornwall Police Department, so that the hospitals, so that if an individual presents in crisis at the time, being homeless, there are additional supports that we have in place. They can present to one of these agencies, and they would be found immediate housing on a very short
So I'll
term.
just stop you there
Okay.
because I don't want the important answer to get lost in the explanation.
Okay.
So phone the police or phone the hospital?
Or
Or
Canadian
go
Mental
there.
Health, or go to the hospital, yes.
Okay. And the police station, you just go in the side door and ring the bell and you'd be admitted and,
And
okay.
the police would more than likely then bring you to the hospital as the point of entry for referral.
Right, okay. That's really good to know, you know. I think those phone numbers or addresses should be well publicized. And then the second question has to do with, came out of a reference you made on page 33. Again, this is Mr. Folds. The private market needs to be encouraged to provide affordable housing. I was glad to hear so many references through your report to the private sector because obviously they're a key partner, and people are in landlording because they appreciate the opportunity for them to conduct their business. But you go on to say that municipal incentives should be used, and I'm just wondering what you mean, like what's the spectrum of community initiatives that we could, municipal initiatives? I know you talked about the instability of the upper levels of government right now with an election coming and that sort of thing, but we're here for another 3.5 years, so there is some stability here. Now, beyond what we do at Cornwall Housing, is there more? Like, I know we subsidize some apartments in the private sector. And is you looking at an expansion of that, or were you thinking of other things? I think I gathered, sorry to keep talking, but you mentioned the Ontario Renovates program without mentioning it, and I'm just wondering if you think that should be accessed by landlords as well, so that they can improve the rental stock, that it wouldn't just be homeowners. So I'd love to hear what you have to say.
So through to you, Your Worship, we do have a number of incentives within our own department that we can offer. Certainly, one of the things that we are considering in the future is opening up the Ontario Renovates program to landlords.
Okay, good.
There have been some additional funding allocations that have recently been announced by the province that would help us pursue that over the next 3 years, perhaps the next 9 years, depending on the change of political parties, if that came to fruition. In turn, we also have rent supplement programs that we can offer internally. All of our programs that we do offer internally are offered, available on our website, or we are developing a system service map that will outline all of that for the public as well as stakeholders, for them to access for their clients as well. In terms of other municipal incentives, I will defer to Mr. Folds to perhaps address that for you.
Okay.
Sure, I'd be happy to, Chair. I think currently there is some incentives that you're using through your community improvement areas in brownfields that help provide for assistance. I think the notion of expanding that in terms of targeting affordability so that you're getting a return on your public investment for providing those incentives. I think the two other areas that we've highlighted that other jurisdictions are looking at are called municipal facilities, municipal capital facilities under the Municipal Act. And it's really a broad umbrella of incentives that once you engage in the authorities, once you take up the authorities from the Act, it allows you to provide incentives to the private sector in exchange for affordability. So typically in the bylaw, you'll define what you mean by affordability. You will define the tools that you're going to be offering in your parent bylaw. And then on a project-by-project basis, you can offer more or less incentives to get more or less affordability. So it's a vehicle for providing those incentives, which you're otherwise restricted from doing in
Right.
other parts of the municipal act. The last area relates to Section 37 bonusing under the Planning Act. And again, it's more common in higher density areas like Toronto as it relates to either height or density enhancements. And really the notion is that in exchange for a community benefit, you would permit certain increase in density beyond the zoning areas. So again, you're trading the right to increase your density or increase the height, and you're calculating a community benefit for that, and then the potential is to use that back as affordable housing. Now, Bill 108 has made some changes recently to those provisions. We're still examining that. There's some consolidation of what you can do under development charges, et cetera. But it is an interesting area that might offer some additional
Sure.
tools to do that.
Yeah, and I was glad to hear that the possibility of Ontario Renovates being expanded to landlords. Do we have the flexibility to do that, or would we have to ask the provincial government, for example, for the latitude? We can do that.
No, we have the authority to do that within
Okay,
our
well, that's
own-
very good. Thank you. And I guess the last question, I'm not sure if it would be directed to you, it might be directed to you, Madam Mayor, or perhaps the fire chief. I know that lately there's been initiative being explored of having residences licensed, like especially rental residences, because sometimes people feel that what they're renting is substandard. And I just wonder where that's going, because I know you've said sometimes in the private sector there are challenges. People can't, afford to make the improvements they'd like to make, and what's happening there? Are we moving toward a licensing of private landlords?
So I'll take that for the first part. So the landlord licensing came up at our strategic planning process. It's been sort of an idea that's been floating out there. And I may ask Mr. Folds to address it from what other municipalities are doing, but I can certainly start by going to
Okay, yeah.
Great. Fire Chief Voisin to give us an update on that topic.
Sure. À travers vous, Madame la Mairesse.
Merci.
So, from brief history, so the Property Standards Committee essentially did some very impressive work with regards to looking at other municipalities that had rental licensing programs, why they did it, how they did it, and how that would work within this municipality. And they prepared a tremendous amount of work. Right now, administration is looking at the mechanics of how, what, and some of the details around that. Now, obviously, there's some apprehension out there with regards to some groups, with regards to the, especially, typically the cost factor and the view that this could potentially be a cash grab. But I could tell you that the approach from the committee was simply, how do you find a way to essentially treat these folks as business owners, right? So business owners have to apply for a permit, and that drives various inspections from municipality departments. But that's not the case with regards to rental housing. So that's the intent. We are currently working on some of the mechanics of that, and then so there is a report that will be coming to council shortly with invariably a number of options. So I think it'll be in council's domain to look at how this could be used in the municipality and what are the various elements in order to implement such a program here.
Thank you. So just to build on that, because the Standard Fielder addressed some of this issue in their review of our strategic planning.
Yeah, I read that.
So I was invited to meet with the Landlord Association, I think back in January. So I attended with Mr. Rogers, our chief building official. And we have a very active and well-organized landlord association. And they expressed significant concerns about the landlord licensing program. So that's the pushback that the fire chief was referring to. So yes, so we're now, we received a lot of information there. We'll continue our dialogue with the Landlord Association, but we do have to wait for our report now from administration so that we're all on the same page.
Right.
I don't know if Mr. Foles can address landlord licensing in other municipalities. Do you have any comments on that, or?
Madam Chair, I think probably the easiest thing to say is that there are different factors at play in different jurisdictions in terms of how municipal bylaws are enforced. I think what I can say based on our experience is that being crystal clear about the intent and the means to get there is very important, and the notion of balancing carrots and sticks. One of the challenges, of course, is that typically this is the most eminently affordable stock in the jurisdiction for a reason. It's not in necessarily the best shape, and therefore commands a price at the low end of the spectrum. So we're trying to balance that notion of reinforcing good and continuing to help support them to continue to be a landlord at those affordable rates. So I think the specific sounds like you'll have a report come forward with lots of good information, but I think the success that I've seen in jurisdictions is really when there's that crystal clarity between the intent and what you're trying to do.
Thank you. Councillor McIntosh.
Thank you. You touched on Bill 108. Is that the one that they're, maybe you can turn your downstairs into an apartment, loosening up the rules? Is that the one you're talking about?
Through the chair, Bill 108 is actually fairly broad, encompassing legislation. It covers planning stuff, it covers development charges, etc. I think there is an element there in terms of, in past legislation, secondary suites were permitted on a discretionary basis, and I think the provincial government was talking about making that a little bit more firm in terms of its obligation.
It's not clear. So I think the Globe Mail described it as ready, shoot, aim. Back to, yeah, you like that one. Back to the affordable housing. You mentioned, I think you were alluding to the low rents in Cornwall. They're a little lower maybe in other places, but the housing stock is many cases, too many cases, less than desirable. There's a reason why the rents are low, because the certain percentage of the housing stock isn't to snuff.
I wouldn't want to draw a clear line between those two things. I think there's a number of causative factors. I think that has an effect for those, in most jurisdictions, the units that are not as well maintained tend to command a lower rent just because the market won't.
Going back to the program then, if we said to landlords, we'll help fund a renovation program we have. So we're going to improve your housing stock. The chances are the rents are going to go up too. Fair statement.
I think what the programs we've seen in other jurisdictions is that, again, notion of what the community benefit is. You're providing some opportunities to access funding, whether that's direct or underwriting loans, or could be a number of other things, in exchange for the affordability. So the notion is that you grant something, but it comes with some strings, and I think that's sort of one of the common themes.
Would absentee landlordship be a problem?
It has potential to be.
Yeah, and I think we have a fair amount of it in the city, I'm told, by real estate people.
I think that's true of.
Well, you don't
a
deal
number
with
of
the landlord
jurisdictions.
anymore, you deal with an agency that he hires to manage his properties.
Yes, in certain instances, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, I understand where the chief's coming from. He has an excellent plan if he ever gets it off the ground. If we can get it off the ground, we're going to inspect houses. But then the challenge will be, how do they comply and what action can we take? And meanwhile, the tenant's caught in the middle of this, and he just wants a place to live with decent living conditions.
Any other questions? Councillor Gardner?
It's more of a comment through you, Madam Mayor. Just before I came, I was out looking at my messages, and from FCM, there were messages that the federal government has put billions of dollars, and I don't remember the number exactly, for to maintain housing stock that needs to be maintained. And I would just hope that you would look at that and tap into it. I don't know if it's a ploy to get more votes, but it was small urban and rural areas that will be able to tap into that kind of money. And it was large amounts in the billions. So I hope you would tap into that.
So through your worship, so the federal government has drafted a national housing strategy, and they have put some significant funding into various housing programs across the country. One of those is a partnership with provinces, and our province has, in the last year, signed a bilateral agreement with the federal government, and that funding announcement has just been released in the last quarter. We did, I believe it was last council meeting, have done a request or a report for transfer payment agreements, and so we have received some of that funding. We've received the first installment, the first stage is for the next 3 years, so we do have our funding allocation, and we will be looking at how we can align that funding with the actions and strategies as we've recommended in the 5-year housing plan.
They're a little late getting us the message. I just got it today, so thank you.
Any other questions? I've got a couple. So, building on Councillor McDonald's comments about community supports coming in at strategic times to save housing, right, to keep people in their housing. So I'm interested in best practices. What is the city's role there to support that sort of thing? What do other cities do? Because I know that it's, hospitals, CMHA, it's different organizations, but does the city have a role to play in that?
So through to your worship, we do sit on a number of committees already that we share information. One of the recommendations from this report is that we draft a housing planning table to be able to bring all of these players together in one spot and create this service system mapping, so that we can hope to start a lot of the prevention, before it gets to a crisis, and start providing supports where tenants need them before they end up, with the eviction or, an eviction due to a lack of support somewhere else. So that is one of the definite shifts that we're making, more the preventative piece as opposed to the reactionary.
Okay. Because, we have a situation table around some issues.
Absolutely.
But this would be, the housing is so critical to so much else, right? So I'm happy to see that's, to hear that. The word inventory, so we don't have an inventory, do we? Or is that something that the fire chief was going to work on, or Ms. Morgan, can you answer that? Because if we don't know what we have, then it's kind of hard for us to be strategic in our plan, right?
Correct. So, Your Worship, we would have an inventory of what we typically refer to as social housing stock.
Okay.
In terms of private market, we wouldn't have an inventory within our own department, and certainly we're looking at across the counties as well.
Right.
So it would be something that we would have to work with economic develop, or planning departments amongst the various townships and within the city to see whether or not we were able to gather that information to determine. That's one of the areas that Mr. Folds was talking about, that gap on where we don't know. So we don't know till we ask, and that would be an area we would have to work on going forward.
So does our plan address that? That's something that's
Yes.
outlined as something that we need to do?
Absolutely.
Okay. Are there like municipalities that have, that we should emulate? Are there, and I guess I'm asking Mr. Folds this, out there in your study of other municipalities, is there something that we should aim for, a city that does things particularly well?
Madam Mayor, I think there's, it's all relative.
Sure.
I think one of the examples that we've talked about with staff constantly is Region Appeal's recent plan. And we found Region Appeal, yeah. And again, I think it's not hard to envision that other communities face similar issues when you talk about the broad continuum, so wanting to address those 4 areas within the continuum. But I think the dynamics of what happens locally makes things a little bit different. So some of the renovation aspects are going to be stronger here. You tend to have lower rental rates as compared to other jurisdictions, and that's just a regional market reality. So some of those, and then the growth rate and some of those other issues all put a little different slant in terms of what you're doing. But I think the good news, as Melissa was noting, is that there's a strong network of sharing of information amongst jurisdictions and service managers. And certainly, again, recently, I think Peel would probably be one of the better examples, although we also looked at a few others and sort of gleaned pieces. So I think the challenge is to sort of ensure that what we're describing for you makes sense in your jurisdiction with thought for some of those other practices that are happening.
I was really, interested in the fact that the private sector was engaged in this process too, and wanting to be, part of the solution. So I find that really interesting. And since our strategic planning, I'm struck by how central housing is to economic development and to resident attraction as well. So do you have, Mr. Folds, recommendations on how we would work with economic development and this plan? And is there a best practice around how we integrate all of that?
Well, Madam Mayor, I think this is an issue that I think a lot of communities are starting to struggle with, and I would say particularly in the last 3 to 4 years. And there's sort of, I think what I would term it as sort of the GTA effect. You have a number of people retiring out of the GTA,
Yep.
taking their equity elsewhere, and the impact that they're having on each of those local markets when they plunk down their equity. They're actually driving up costs in a number of communities. We're doing some work right now in Picton, and they're having some real issues in Prince Edward County, both from the fact of retiring households, but also short-term accommodation, to the point where they're actually bringing regulations now to try and deal with Airbnb and some of those other providers, because it's decimating their rental market when it's in season for seasonal rentals. So I think what that's done in turn has changed the focus from this just being something that housing advocates look at to the whole community saying, we've got a problem, and private sector starting to engage and say, well, the threads are all connected. We need to be a part of the solution. So I think there's a lot more willingness to have this discussion than there was maybe 5 years ago. I think in terms of engaging the Economic Development Department and connecting more directly with the private sector. So talking about, as I think we have in vision number 4, what are some of the needs that the private sector sees out there in terms of impediments? What are some ways to overcome that? Again, trying to balance the public interest in doing that. And having that connection to say that we all agree that having adequate affordable housing makes sense for everybody in the community, not just certain constituencies. And that when we talk about who provides that housing in the community, it really is both the private sector and the public. I mean, by and large, 90-95% of what gets built out there is from the private sector. Right? So they're having that dialogue and discussion and having the connections. Really, it's about building those relationships the same way we've done on the support service side and with those other housing providers to sort of transfer some of that thinking and dialogue over to the private sector. Not always going to see eye to eye, but I think having a more frank discussion, understanding where the pressure points are and where things can be helped to achieve that housing on the private sector side. That dialogue starts typically at the tip of the spear with economic development and the local development industry.
Before I go to Councillor McDonald, is there anything that we do particularly well here in terms of, you've reevaluated our plan 5 years in?
I think the first preface I would say is something that I would say to any council, in that the first iterations of plans across the province were done at a time when there was not much known about housing and homeless plans and how that was done. So I think everyone's first go at those plans, there was a bit of a patchwork in terms of that. That said, I mean, I think what we heard time and again through the support groups is you have a number of great support agencies and a lot of interaction and enthusiasm to do things. Just a matter of getting maybe a bit more organized, so that's great. I think your housing department's been very good at getting dollars out into the community, continuing the dialogue with community housing providers. That's all good. I think the challenge is in the barrage of that ever-changing policy environment, trying to continue to deliver housing programs, meet those needs. There's going to be some things that won't get the same attention. And I think the plan helps sort of set out some of those areas where there could be a bit more work, a bit more thought. So I think on the whole, I'd say, your jurisdiction's doing well in terms of that, but I think in that ever-changing environment, there's always things that'll come up that need further attention.
Thank you. Councillor McDonald.
Thank you. Just a little follow-up, something the chief said made me wonder, do we have a registry of landlords, people who rent out apartments within their own homes? Do they have to register with the city? I mean, it's a business, or is this just something people do and we don't know? So we don't have any handle on that at all.
Ms. Morgan, do you want to take that, or should I?
Through you, Madam Mayor, I would not begin to be able to give you a number of what are perhaps legitimate housing rental stock versus
So I
sharing
see.
of.
I didn't understand that we didn't know when somebody, opens up part of their home to somebody else and charges rent. Their income tax obviously must show it, I would think. I don't know. Well,
I'll ask the fire chief to address.
Well, thank you, through you, Madam Mayor. Herein lies the issue. And I would offer that it's not also what we don't know, but it's also what some of these homeowners don't know in terms of what are the code requirements to build these apartments and to build. So the code applies differently to an apartment in a home or a triplex, and different types of occupancies in there. So that is why we have such a challenge in terms of identifying what we have in the community, and then how to address them that way and making them safe from my perspective.
Wow. Thank you. Any further comments, questions? Councillor Mack?
Chief, am I reading this right? You could go to a house fire, have 4 people living in the basement, you don't have a clue they're there.
Through you, Madam Mayor, that happens on a daily basis, not only from the fire perspective, but from complaints from tenants. Our fire inspection division essentially runs on complaints 70% of the time. And we will get a complaint from a tenant, we'll go into a building, we had no idea had that amount of apartments. And that's part of the issue.
So that not only puts the people living there at risk, puts firefighters at risk.
For sure, we've seen cases where we will go to a home that has a basement apartment with someone living in that it's not even suitable to be an apartment, unfinished walls, no secondary means of exit. There's a lot of these in the community.
It's probably not unique to Cornwall either.
No.
Thank you for that comment, yeah. So, Mr. Folds, thank you very much for your work and for your presentation and answering our questions. And thank you to Ms. Morgan and Ms. Ferguson and the staff in your department for the work and the countless hours that went into the development of this plan. So we look forward to August 12th when we can approve it or review it, probably approve it at that point if we have more questions and get more information. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
The next few categories, Madam Mayor, do not have any submissions. Those are delegations, consent, resolutions, and unfinished business reports. So we're going to move on to.
Point of order.
Oh, yes, Councilor Grant.
We need a motion to receive.
Oh, sorry. We're not approving it, we'll receive it, right? Is that it? Okay. Councilor Grant? Motion to receive? Seconded by Councilor Gardner. All in favor? Carried. Thank you.
2019 distribution of provincial child care wage enhancement grant with the recommendation that the City of Council, or the Council of the City of Cornwall to enter into new service agreements with child care operators and home child care providers for the purpose of distributing the provincial child care wage enhancement grant.
Councilor McDonald?
I'd like to move that.
Yes, seconded by Councilor DePel. Questions, comments? All in favor? Carried.
Energy Conservation and Demand Management Plan Update 2019 to 2023 with a recommendation that Council receive this report.
Just got it.
Councilor Bergeron?
Please excuse me. Sorry, I
That's fine.
would like to make,
Yes, go ahead.
I'd like to make a motion to defer, if I may, if I can get a seconder.
Okay, is there a Councilor Towndale, seconds? Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. Reason being, I think I've been pretty vocal on, kind of confused sometimes on process here, but there's a lot in this report. We're talking about a 30% reduction of energy consumption, which I think is amazing, which is, I think, the kind of bold thing we need to be doing as a city. I think the implementation side of this report needs a little bit more voice from council, I suppose, before receiving it. So I'd like to defer it for 2 weeks. I would encourage my fellow councillors to do what I'm hoping to do and speak with our administrators on maybe putting a little more action items in this report that can help us as a council move this forward for the next 5 years. So that is my request, I suppose.
Okay, so on the motion to defer this matter, for further discussion between council and Councilor Bergeron and administration. Comments? Other Councilor Grant?
Thank you. I read the report and I see there's ongoing actions, et cetera. Are we going to try and look at, is intent to look at an update of that? Or is it to just to see where we are when it comes to some are ongoing, a lot are completed? What's the intent of the deferral? Is it to look at new initiatives? Is that?
Councilor Bergeron?
Yes, if I may. So a lot of those action items that you're talking about were from the last 5 years. I'm talking about the next 5 years. The action items to me are a little gray, aren't specific enough for this council to implement. So that's what I'm hoping to achieve in the next 2 weeks.
Thank you, Madam Mayor.
Is that motion to defer clear? Madam Clerk?
Yes, but I'd like to clarify that it would be 4 weeks because of the
Yeah.
summer committee.
4 weeks it is.
I heard the next council.
Next council meeting.
Councilor McIntosh?
Requires some input from administration. Do we have enough time with vacation coming up?
Okay.
But not, Maureen, you've already got a lot on your plate.
Madam Clerk?
We have 4 weeks, so I think that the sooner we get some feedback and interaction from council, the better. We should be able to try and get it back on the August 9th meeting. And if not, if we need more time, we'll provide a communication to council and have a meeting following.
Is that okay?
Yeah, sure. Fine with them, fine with me.
Councilor McDonald? Yeah.
So basically, I just had a question of Councilor Bergeron for you. So the actionable items on page, I can't see a page number 57-4 opposite, well, 585 is the number at the bottom of the page, but the numbers aren't aligned, so I'm presuming you know what I mean. So you want more, or you just want a paragraph instead of a sentence sort of thing, or point forms or details in there? Or are you actually looking for more actionable items? Or kind of a report card, how much we accomplished in the last period of time, or?
Councilor Bergeron?
So it's pretty simple. I look at the plan moving forward, and I don't see enough actionable items. So instead of us debating that tonight, my idea is to work with administration, bring it back to this council for approval as a whole. I just find this process is, we received this a few days ago. There's a lot in here to reduce emissions or to reduce energy consumption by 30% is a really bold target. I just don't see enough in this report to say how we're going to do that. So I'd like a little more detail on that before it comes to this council for approval. That is my ultimate mission.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any further comment? Would it be Mr. Goodwin that, so Mr. Goodwin, you're okay with Councillor Bergeron or other councillors wanting to interact with you on some of these issues?
Through you, Madam Mayor. Yes, that's fine. I have a small question, though. It'd be nice to understand that a little bit more. My understanding of the plan is that it's a planning tool that would lead into some decision-making tools, which would be budget and things like that. So my understanding of the plan is that it wasn't to decide to do something. It was to create a planning process to decide to do something. So I guess then if we would like to, what I think I'm hearing, so it would be nice to get a little bit more detail, that we would like to move it from a planning tool to more a decision-making tool. Does that make, that's what I'm trying to understand, I guess. And then yes, absolutely we can get that done, and we can create a plan to decide how long that would take.
Did you want to comment on that, Councilor Bergeron?
Well, I just, yes, I agree. That is the idea, is to come up with a little bit more of a plan. And I just find we get these reports, and then we vote on them, but it's received, it's just not enough of council input before it actually comes to council. I find this process a little backwards, and so to me, I'd much rather defer it, work with you on some of these items that we're talking about, which are exactly what you're talking about, or how do we implement this? How do we, like greenhouse gas emissions aren't really talked about in this, but that is an item we should be measuring in the future. So I would love your input on that. We haven't really had enough time to discuss that in full. Maybe it's not something we can track. I don't know. We really haven't had enough time from the time this report has been given to us to the time we're being asked to. So that, to me, is a broken process. And so I would like to take that 4 weeks between council meetings to work with admin on this report, which I think has a great end goal, but not enough detail for this council to approve. Personally, if this report was just being, I would not approve it as is. And so instead of standing up today and targeting very specific line items in this, I think that's the role we need to take as councillors, is to work with you a little bit more before it comes to council for a motion. It's still a public conversation. It's still a report that we will be implementing. This is a really big project for the next 5 years, I feel, and a lofty goal, certainly from our strategic plan that we talked about a few weeks ago. This would be a major part of that strategic plan moving forward. So I just feel we don't have enough input to pass it yet, personally. Hope that answers your question.
Councilor Gardner.
I'll vote to defer it if we can put more teeth in it and get specific ideas of where we want to go. The only issue I have with it is it's a one-man show with them, and the rest of council isn't involved in putting extra information into this report. So how do we as a council be part of the decision-making or add to what you want to put into it?
So I'll answer that, and then I'll ask the CAO to address that as well. So, from my perspective, it's never a one-man show. When
Okay,
counselors.
Wrong choice of words. I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
no. When counselors want to engage and, inform and add to the process, then they're always encouraged to do so with administration. And then once that happens, it comes back here for debate. Now, Councillor Bergeron is going to meet with Mr. Goodwin. That's great. Councillor Gardner, you may also provide some input. Councillor Caroline Hébert, Councillor Hollingsworth may want to engage in the next few weeks. In fact, administration likes for councillors to engage ahead of council meetings. Always makes it better. But once it comes back here, it's up for debate. So all of us then take a look at it.
I open
and
this with, yes, I'll agree with deferring it. If we can get more specific on how we're gonna do this.
Got it.
Thank you for your.
Madam CEO, do you want to add to that?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Absolutely agree with everything you said, and we do appreciate input and feedback from council, and especially with respect to something like this. Anybody who would like to provide some feedback, we would like to have it. The sooner the better, because it allows us to work on it depending on what some of your questions might be or what some of your thoughts are. It might take a little bit of additional research. I would encourage that. And it also, even leading up to a council meeting, even if you've received a report and we don't have enough time to maybe make those changes prior to a Monday evening council meeting, administration could potentially also help council with respect to some background of some discussions to allow for some deferrals as well. So we're happy to engage in those conversations.
Councillor Grant, on the
It's the
deferral.
second time, if you don't mind. I know
Please.
I'm a stickler for procedure.
You are.
so
Please go ahead.
Thank you. On page 52, if you look at the vision goals yearly, it's pretty clear. There's an energy task force that established a task force. Now, councillors can apply or ask to be part of a task force, and then it talks about the goals of for the next 3 years, 10%, 10%, 10%. How you're going to achieve that, I wouldn't have a clue how to do that myself, but Eric's got a good resource at his disposal. His father could probably help a lot with energy in electrical contractors. I'm saying to be part of a task force would be an excellent way of contributing to putting this all together. So.
Okay. Thank you for that comment. Any further comment on the deferral? I'll speak and say that I'll support the deferral. I think that there's also been community feedback on this topic, and I agree with Councillor Bergeron that, like housing, sustainability, environmental issues are really part of our 5 priorities. So it makes sense to take the time needed to get this right. So I'll support the deferral. Do you want to wrap up, or are you okay?
No, I mean, I think I said in my first statement is that, look, I just find the process a little bit broken. We received this report on Wednesday night. I read it on Thursday. There's some good things in there, but as councillors, we only get 4 or 5 days, and then we have to vote on it. And to me, that's the broken part. I'd like to participate in the development of it a little bit more, to bring to council for a debate. Obviously, everything is always approved here at council. But the other process would be me standing up and making 14 different motions to edit something, and we saw that during budget. That doesn't always work. This is much more process than conflict, I suppose, ultimately. So I think it's pretty straightforward. I encourage you all to speak as well to administration. I will be, and that is ultimately, it comes back to council for debate, always, and I encourage that.
Madam CEO?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So I'd just like to make a few comments and thank Councillor Bergeron for his feedback. What we have been trying to do in administration over the last several years, if we have a new plan or a major policy or a major document that we're bringing to council for council to consider approving, you will often see us bring that document to one meeting with the expectation of getting that document approved at the following meeting if there is not any direction received from council. So we like to bring the documents forward to council. It's a way to bring it forward in a public meeting, make sure the public's aware that we're looking at that document. And then we do also want to make sure that we allow for a meeting following that if we want to incorporate the changes. So that is typical to our process. Some of the items might require a bylaw, but we always bring, for major items, we bring them to one meeting. Similar to social housing this evening, we had a presentation this evening with our consultant. We'll be coming back at a following meeting to look for council's adoption with that plan. If council has concerns, then we're looking for that feedback between now and that future meeting so that we can hopefully incorporate those changes, address any questions, and be able to have it be approved.
Thank you. All in favor of the deferral? Against? Carried.
Moving on to tenders. Tender 19T46, joint tender for the supply and delivery of winter highway course salt. The recommendation is that item 1, option A of this tender be awarded to Compass Minerals Canada Corporation from Mississauga, Ontario at the total bid price of $949,200.
Moved by Councillor Grant, seconded by Councillor Gardner. All in favor? Against? Carried.
Tender 19T53, supply and delivery of service cargo van, with a recommendation that this tender be awarded to Miller Hughes Ford Sales from Cornwall at the total bid price of $51,973.22.
Moved by Councillor Gardner and Councillor McDonald. All in favor? Carried.
Request for pre-qualification 19PQ01 for supply and delivery of Cornwall Fire Services bunker gear, with a recommendation that council approve the purchase of bunker gear from the pre-qualified proponents, M&L Supply Fire and Safety, PPE Solutions Incorporated, and Safe Design Apparel Limited for a period of 3 years at a combined total cost of $77,515.23.
Moved by Councillor Grant, seconded by Councillor Bergeron. Discussion? All in favor? Carried.
The next category is new business, and I have no new reports.
No new business?
Passing of bylaws, that bylaws 2019-90 to 94 inclusive, listed on the agenda, be taken as read and passed.
Councillor Grant, Councillor Hollingsworth, any discussion? All in favor? Carried.
Reports from standing special committees of council.
Councillor McDonald.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I'd like to announce that there will be a show, a very important show by Audrey and Alan Bain at Klein House Studio. The vernissage is going to be July 24th. And this is really important to the city of Cornwall because a percentage of the sales of Alan Bain's artwork is going to be given to the Art Trust Fund for the City Art Center. So mark that date, July 24th. And before that, on July 18th, the community group that organized the picnic for the sesquicentennial year that we had on the patio of the Civic Complex is at it again. And they've chosen July 18th as a day for a community picnic. And this is a potluck picnic. Whether you choose to bring a sandwich, well, bring 2 instead. One for yourself and one to share. Bring your family members. We'll have kids' games. We'll have entertainment. For example, if you have a guitar and can play it and sing, bring that too, and you'll be the de facto entertainment. It's a no-cost thing. And if we have rain, we'll just simply move inside into Salon B. But otherwise, we'll be right in the patio. And then at 7 o'clock, 4 o'clock will be the picnic. And then at 7 o'clock, we can just go down the hill and we will hear a band that has gotten together again after a 15 years hiatus.
Bordertown Boys.
That's right. Yeah, so they'll be on at 7 o'clock down the hill, so we can picnic from 4 on and then just go down and hear the entertainment then. And also, down the hill on July 21st, from our recreation department, the Shakespeare in the Park will happen. And I don't know the play, I don't know, would Mr. Fothrop know? I texted Lauren, but I didn't get an answer, so we will have Shakespeare in the Park on Sunday night, July 21st. Last year it rained and we had it in the Civic Complex and it worked very well. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Meldrum, do you know which one it is? No? All right, just checking. Any other reports from standing committees?
Our next item is the unfinished business listing for July 8th, and the recommendation is that council receive this listing.
Councilor Dupel?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I've received a couple of phone calls, and then of course we were greeted this evening by some people outside asking questions regarding the feral cat. So I guess what I'd like to know through you to maybe Madam CAO is, what are we waiting for to deliver the report? Because the report's been pushed to September 23rd, I believe, and so I guess just so the public knows, what are we waiting on?
Right.
So through you, Madam Mayor, I'm sorry, I don't have enough information with me this evening to be able to provide you with that. What I can do, though, is I can go back to the department to see if we can provide an update sooner than that. So we'll see if we can bring the report forward, and then also send a communication to council to let them know that, and see if we can be able to, we might be able to move it up to the next meeting. I'll see what we can do.
That would be much appreciated. Thank you.
Councilor Bergeron?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. At the last meeting, I asked, and I didn't have a chance to speak to Madam CEO, for dates tied to all of the items, but there's still some TBD. Can you maybe give me some insight on, will the next meeting have maybe some dates tied to these items?
Through you, Madam Mayor, so some of these reports still require, I think, a little bit more planning on our administrative side. Some of them also require some involvement with committees of council. So through that, we can try and get dates lined up. I don't want to, I think that the ones we know that we could bring forward a little bit quicker, that's why we have those dates indicated, and then we will work on providing dates for the following ones.
Okay.
Do you have, is there?
No, well, Waterfront Pop-Up Project is the one I'm kind of digging at, and it sounds to me like that's a next year project, not a this summer project.
So if I may, Madam Mayor, when Councillor Bennett brought that forward, he indicated looking at a report on that in the fall to see how some of the successes in Belleville occurred so that it could be implemented in 2020. So if the expectation of council is different than that, then we'd certainly like to have that information. But that was the feedback that I had received from Councillor Bennett.
No, generally speaking, I would love to have dates, so as soon as you can have dates tied to these, the happier I would be in the future. So we talked about it last meeting, I'm just hoping it comes maybe at the last meeting. Thank you.
Thank you. Any further comments on that list? I will add that we had a strategic planning, so we had a very busy month of June, as this council knows. We did team building, we did meeting with Mohawk Council, and we also had strategic planning. So it's been busy for everyone. And now we need to make sure that we approve of the strategic planning process. And we may want to have an extra council meeting at some point to discuss as council the strategic plan before we receive the report from administration. So I don't know if anybody has any comment on that, but we're thinking that we might want to bring council back together to have further discussion on the strategic plan. Does that sound like something we can schedule? I see Councillor Dupel nodding. Councillor Bergeron?
Well, yeah, I fully support that idea that we meet as a council first.
Councillor Dupel?
Oh, I agree.
You agree? Okay. So we're looking at doing that, maybe adding it to the front of a PAC meeting, or on a day when we don't have an in-camera, maybe adding a piece so that we could, as a council, further discuss the strategic plan. Okay?
All right, next item. Confirming bylaw. That bylaw 2019-95, being a bylaw to confirm the proceedings of the council of the city of Cornwall at its meeting held on Monday, July 8th, having been read, be now taken and passed.
Moved by, oh. Sorry, Madam Clerk.
You're correct. We had the mover, but not the seconder. For the unfinished business.
So we had Councillor DePel move it, I think.
That's correct.
We needed a seconder for the unfinished business listing. Councillor Towndale, all in favor? Thank you. Now for the now for the confirming bylaw. We need a mover. Councillor Gardner, Councillor McIntosh, all in favor? Just a quick comment. Thank you to the fire department for the sprinkling of the kids in the park. So we're getting a lot of good feedback for that. And you may want to maybe spread the love around, maybe go to some different parks. Anyway, just putting it out there. Love to hear more feedback on that, but from what I saw, the kids really enjoyed that. And I think it's somebody's birthday today. Is it maybe,
Not mine, no.
maybe Jeff Clark's birthday? Happy birthday, Mr. Clark.
Thank you, Madam Mayor.
Happy birthday to you.
Wow, Councilor
Come on, Dean.
Gardner.
Happy birthday, dear Mr. Clark. Happy birthday to you.
Thank you.
Councilor Gardner, good job.
Special day. Every birthday is a special.
Enjoy the day. Motion to adjourn. Councillor Towndale, Councillor Bergeron, all in favor? Thank you, folks. Enjoy the weather.